Okay, so I think now I actually officially figured out my audio. So I had to connect my headphones and use the speaker through that, so hopefully you're getting it through that and not my laptop, which for some reason just does not want to record quality audio. So if the audio is really that bad in chapters 12 and 13 and you need me to kind of redo it, please let me know. But aside from that, I'm going to kind of speak into these headphones. Hopefully that gives you some quality audio. So, moving on. Here we are to chapter 14. So, some reminders. Career day. Email me the email contact and the 2 sources by the 14th. Make sure you get credit for that. So do that by the 14th of April. And chapter 14 is separation and divorce, right? So we've talked about divorce throughout the entire semester. We've talked about separation. We've talked about the institutions that can influence these things. And then last chapter we talked about some reasons some people might get separated or divorced, right? With that violence and abuse and so on and so forth. So nevertheless, the actual meat and bones of separation and divorce. So, some types of separation, right? We have this idea of trial separation. That's living apart while deciding if they want to be permanent. So, this could be, a couple is going through a rough patch and, they say they need a break, right? But they were living together, but now they say they need a break. So, they split up, or at least, they take a break. And they live apart from each other, right? They're trialing, right? They're testing whether they want to stay separated. Then they could choose, right, to just live apart, right? That's this next one. So it could be during the trial separation, or when the couple chooses, they say it is best if we don't get back together, right? We tried it. Now, after giving it some time, we can tell this is best. And then that kind of leads into permanent separation. So after this trial separation, they really solidify, we're going to live apart or we're splitting up, right? Because I've signed a new lease, I've bought a new place, so on and so forth. And then there's legal separation, which if you're not legally connected with the person via civil union, marriage, something like that, you don't necessarily need legal separation, but of course this is the most formal type if you are married, right? There's some kind of agreement about you being separated. Now this, of course, when we talk about legal separation, we're often talking about divorce, right? Now it can be civil union, right? Domestic partnership, all those kind of things, but nevertheless it's usually about divorce. So the rate of divorce has decreased. And I want folks to think about, really think about why that might be. Oftentimes we hear about, oh man, divorce is as bad as it's ever been. The divorce rate is increasing and 1 out of 2 marriages, yada, yada, yada. I don't know if I've mentioned this in class before, but there's a tricky little, reason why that stat may be so high. And to kind of spoil the fun a little bit, the reason why the divorce rate has actually really increased, the rate of divorce has actually decreased, is that when we think about the number of people actually getting divorced, it's usually one person that accounts for divorce multiple times. Right? So one guy gets divorced 4 times. Right? Or one woman is married 3 different times and she gets divorced twice, right? So it's the actual rate of divorce is really decreasing. It just seems high because it's the same people getting divorced over and over and over again, right? Oftentimes people get divorced once, right, and they kind of call it a day, or they get married again, right? That's it. So the rate of divorce is actually decreasing. Children are more likely to live with which divorced parent? Right? It's the moms. We've talked about kind of why, the gender roles behind that, the kind of social perception that women are caregivers, therefore the children should go with the woman if they're split up. And then that should lead into the next question. Divorced women or men are more likely to receive public assistance. Right? Divorced women are. Because again, they have a child, and the federal government and state government usually give some kind of public assistance or benefits to families with children. So if a man does not have a children, he does not receive those benefits, but the woman does. So we have divorce systems and laws. So a couple chapters back, we're talking about like different kinds of marriages, right? Usually we think about there only being one kind of marriage, but then we have a kind of like extra marriage, right? Well, when we think about just the law and legal system, right, marriages are supposed to be sacred, right? They're supposed to be the end-all, be-all. They are supposed to be this, bond with somebody beyond society, right? And usually, or not usually, but annulments were really considered rare, right? Because again, if you entered into marriage, it was supposed to be this sacred thing that you were entering into. However, we started to recognize that, yes, marriage is important, but there is a need for fault-based divorce. So there's a need for divorce based on somebody committing adultery, neglect, desertion, and cruel and inhumane treatment, aka abuse. Right? We started to recognize that, some marriages don't just fall apart because they don't like each other. Sometimes one person is in fear for their life, or they are in danger, and therefore divorce is needed. Right? So if those things are violated, absolute divorce is granted, or should be granted. However, if somebody claims, right, there's neglect or desertion or abuse, and they want a divorce, they're going to have to go in front of a judge and have evidence and prove that these things are happening, and sometimes that can be incredibly difficult. How do you go in front of a judge, right, where your abuser is potentially in the same courtroom as you, and you're supposed to just air all of your dirty laundry to this judge that you've been abused, and the other person can respond back and deny it? Yikes, that's tough. But nevertheless, we created a system for fault-based divorce. Then in 1970, California passed the Family Law Act that allowed folks to get divorced based on irreconcilable differences. And that simply means you don't like each other anymore, right? Of course it can be more than that, but oftentimes folks that get divorced because they fell out of love, or they just they disagree on one, like whether you want kids or you don't want kids, and they didn't address that before they got married, they're allowed to get divorced based on, well, she wants kids, I don't want kids. That is an irreconcilable difference between us. And that divorce has allowed for what we see now, where many, many, many folks get divorced because they have fallen out of love, all of this different stuff. Right? So there's many different ways folks can get divorced. Right? Some are fault-based, some are no fault-based. There's simply those differences. So what actually causes divorce, right? Many of you in the room have mentioned, or many of you in the class, I shouldn't say room because we're not really in a room, but many of you in the class have recognized and said before that you have come from families that have, experienced divorce, right? Your parents were divorced and you've experienced divorce, and you can recognize when we talk about certain things in class, how those pertain to a married couple versus a divorced couple, right? Many of you have already said this. So many of you already have an inherent understanding about what causes divorce, right? But it's easy to say, oh, this thing caused it, but really no single thing causes divorce, right? And this can be a tricky thing to kind of wrap your head around, because if we think about, right, abuse, adultery, neglect, desertion, cruel and inhumane treatment, it can be a mixed bag, because on one hand, if adultery goes on, you can say, oh, well, and we've chatted about this in class before. Oh, well, one person wasn't receiving the attention that they needed, so they committed adultery. Well, one person could argue, well, that person committed adultery, that's what caused the divorce. Somebody else could argue, no, it was the one person not giving the person who committed adultery the attention that they needed. So it was on both parties. Right? You can see how this is a slippery slope. People even apply that same kind of logic even towards cases of violence. Right? So, oh, they hit me. Well, they were insulting me. They got frustrated. They hit that person back. Right? Again, violence is not okay. But in a court of law, one person could argue that the person who committed that physical violence was, egged into it, right? They were kind of forced into that violence, right? So that is a very slippery slope, and I don't necessarily agree with that line of logic, but it's important to think about when we recognize, or when we unpack, that's the better word, when we unpack divorce. Sometimes we like to think that it's one cause, but we just need to recognize, we just need to recognize that there are more things at play than what we usually first see. So some potential other factors that may cause divorce are some demographic challenges, societal norms, lifestyle differences, right? So what are some examples of these? Go back 60 years ago, you could argue demographic challenges would be a difference in race, right? If a white woman married a black man 60 years ago, people would not be able to handle that, right? Like, that was not a societal norm back then. Even now, some people still wouldn't be able to process that, right? Interracial marriages. And so that could be a demographic challenge. That also directly plays into a societal norm, right? What are the norms that you're expected to follow as a black woman, as a white man, as a Hispanic woman, right? Like, what are those societal norms, and how do those norms influence your marriage and potentially, therefore, influence your divorce? Right? Same thing with lifestyle differences. If you want to spend a ton of money, right, regardless of what identity you are, if you're a big spender and your partner is not a big spender, and that is one thing that you just cannot figure out together, that could cause a divorce. So, as we were talking about demographic factors, right, let's think about education level, right? So college graduates have been shown to have more stable marriages. Why might this be? Right, one reason that the data shows, that the research argues, is that if you are a college graduate, you are more than likely to have a stable job. And if you have a stable job and your partner has a stable job, then usually that means you have solid money coming in, and when people aren't stressed about money, usually they're able to kind of invest more in their relationships. Right? That makes sense. Differences between couple education, though, has been shown to have higher chances of divorce. So if one person in the marriage has a PhD and the other person dropped out of high school, right, kind of almost internally we kind of have this weird feeling of like, whoa, like that'd be kind of weird. right? Because this internally makes sense. That oftentimes couples seek out partners, people seek out partners that are similar in their educational level. Right? It is very rare that somebody with a PhD marries somebody that dropped out of high school. Sure, it's possible, but it's a little more rare. And if they did, they're of a higher chance to get divorced than, say, two people who only got associate's degrees. Income level, right? As we were just mentioning with the jobs, if you have more money, the perception is less stress. If you have more debt, the perception is more stress. However, as Biggie once said, more money, more problems, right? Or specifically, more money, more problems. So not necessarily more money equals less stress, right? Because oftentimes, we know the more money we have, the more stuff, the more we spend on just random stuff, right? If you get a big house, you got to fill that big house with stuff. Right? And that stuff can fall apart and that can cause you stress, right? So it's not always more money equals less stress. However, I'm not going to lie. If I had more money right now, I would probably be less stressed, as would all of you. If you had more money right now, you'd probably be less stressed. But nevertheless, good to think about. And then again, employment status. Low status jobs are more likely to divorce, usually because of this idea that you are in an unstable environment, right? You're not making a ton of money. You probably don't have health care coverage, don't have retirement, right? Things are unstable, and marriages need that stability to thrive. Unemployment, same thing. And women working, right, are usually less dependent and have more partner options, right? Again, this makes sense. If women are working, then they're not staying at home relying on the man or the partner, not just a man, but whoever they are married to, right, to bring home the money, right? They are not dependent on that person. They are making their own money, and if they wanted to leave, they could because they have their own money, right? And therefore, they also have more partner options. Again, they're not dependent on just one person. Religion is a factor in regards to demographics, right? All major religions usually discourage divorce. However, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, right? All of these major religions allow for divorce if they are this kind of fault-based system. Right, in regards to adultery, neglect, desertion, all of these major religions, and I'm not a scholar in Judaism or Islam, so I can't say that too much, but from what I understand, all these major religions are okay with divorce if it's in regards to that fault-based system. But aside from that, if you were to want to get divorced based on irreconcilable differences, the majority of major religions would say you got to figure that out. You got to work that out. So therefore, it should be no surprise that religious couples are less likely to get divorced, because if you are, say, Catholic, and you've grown up being told, don't get divorced, don't get divorced, don't get divorced, then you grow up, you're probably going to be thinking, okay, I shouldn't get divorced, right? Because that was a belief that you grew up with. We already chatted about race and ethnicity in regards to that acceptance, that support, right? Interracial marriages, all that. Now, what are some societal factors? Right? We have this idea of social integration. So social, meaning, right, the society, the people around us, and then integration being that developing connection with the folks around us. Right? So how can this influence separation and divorce? Right? If you are interacting with the community, right, both partners have clubs that they're a part of, have friends that they are, interacting with, have a good job environment that they enjoy going to, right? They have high interaction that usually leads to a lower divorce rate, right? And this comes back to this level of dependency, right? Of course, you're going to depend on your partner to a certain extent, but if the both parties, both people are only interacting with each other, you're going to drive each other nuts, right? No matter how much you love the other person, you need other folks to interact with. And the data shows it, that the more interaction you have with your community, right, the more well-rounded a person is, the better partner they usually are, therefore lower divorce rate. However, it's been argued that the higher diversity in the United States has led to a higher divorce rate. Why might this be? Right? Some people argue that 100 years ago, with less diversity in the United States, there was less divorce. But could there be some confounding variables, right? Difference in laws? Maybe. Right? I want you to answer that kind of for yourself. Right? Diversity in the U.S. has led to a higher divorce rate. But what are the various factors that could influence that? Difference in laws? Is it easier to get divorced? Are there different people nowadays that, you may, have different options, right? Is it the cultural attitude around divorce, right? I want you to answer that for yourself. So that leads into this cultural sense of values, right? So again, could it be a cultural perception of divorce that has changed, right? Have we had a shift in happiness? What the heck does that mean? Shift in happiness. I think if you think about it enough, we've chatted about it in previous classes. This idea that, again, 50, 100 years ago, folks would get married for what? They would get married for stability, right? They would get married because it was, one, just time to get married. But if we think about it from a social exchange perspective, people got married 100 years ago because, they needed that stability. They needed a house over their heads, right? They needed to have kids, right? It was just, they didn't necessarily marry because of love. They didn't marry because they found their soulmate. They married because, well, in order to advance my career, I need to be a married man, right? Or in order to, have a fulfilling life, I guess I need to have kids and buy a home. Well, I guess I got to get married. But folks, many folks were happy with that, right? But nowadays, folks who marry their soulmate, right, they're also happy, right? So could there be a shift in what we think happiness is? And how does the media play into that? Just like everything else in this class, right? Media has an influence. And I want you to watch that clip on your own time. But nevertheless, think about, how does media influence why folks are getting married, but also why folks are getting divorced? Is it possible that the media almost gets in the way of us actually being happy? Right? You think you're in a good relationship and you love your partner, but on TV you see these almost unrealistic perceptions of marriage, and then you start to question your own marriage, right? Could that get in the way of your own happiness? Alright, so let's think of some lifestyle factors. Right? So there's this really interesting phenomena about when you get married, how old you are. Right? So if you're married under 18, if you get married earlier than being 18 years old, after 10 years of being married, roughly 48% of those folks will get divorced. Right? So again, say you get married at 17. Right? So you are married at 17 years old. You're under 18. Roughly by the time you hit 27, so after 10 years, roughly half of those folks will have been divorced. That is wild. However, if you get married at 25 or older, after the same 10 years, right? So at 35, roughly a quarter will be divorced. Why such a big difference? Hopefully, it's almost kind of self-explanatory, right? Many of you, again, in the quote-unquote virtual room, many of you in this class, you're 18, you're 19, you're 20. Think about if you were already married at 16, 17, right? And that's legal in many states. Think of how much is changing in your life. And to have somebody along for the ride, right, to be married to somebody that also has a ton changing in their life, that's a lot to handle. And some folks can do it, sure. But some folks are not able to do that, right? So that should make sense why there's such a big difference. If you're 28 and you get married, right, and you have a stable job and you already have retirement savings, and so does your partner, that makes sense why that might be more successful or have a higher likelihood of being successful. Because again, marriages need stability, right? And you're more likely to be stable when you're older than 25 versus younger than 18. Premarital pregnancy is certainly a lifestyle factor. Many folks get married because they have some kind of pregnancy. Right? Of course, some folks don't, but I'm sure we all know somebody in our lives who, they didn't practice, protect, or they didn't have protection, or they didn't have some kind of contraception, and they, had a premarital pregnancy, right? Or they had an unexpected pregnancy. And they decided to get married and then have the child, right? So that certainly is a factor in why some folks get married. And then we talked about cohabitation a couple chapters ago, right? So again, premarital cohabitation, over 50% dissolved after 5 years, right? But again, not all researchers agree with this sentiment, right? The jury is still out on why this may be. We've chatted about this in class too, the different theories around, is it good to live with somebody beforehand, is it not? And then of course, as we just mentioned in the last chapter, intergenerational transmission. If your parents got divorced, you are more likely to get divorced. And if you got divorced, your kids are more likely to get divorced. So, this one researcher named Bohannon came up with these stations, right? And so now a station is an interesting term because it doesn't necessarily mean steps, right? Because a step almost assumes when you move on from it, then it's just done, right? Then that's it. But a station is more like I am here in this moment, and I can go to another station, but I may need to come back to this station, and then I go back to that other station again, but then I go to this new one, right? A step is a very sequential thing. But these stations you can be in 4 of them at one time, you can be in 1 of them at one time. Does that kind of make sense? So that's what a station is. So station number 1, in regards to what kind of divorce or the station of divorce you are in, number 1 is emotional divorce, right? And this is the postponement of legal divorce, usually for children, right? But you're emotionally separated from the person. right? So you are kind of becoming apathetic towards that person, but that often leads to less conflict, right? If you kind of just don't care what that person's doing anymore, you've emotionally divorced yourself from that person. You kind of don't care what they do, and they don't care what you do. So you can kind of just do whatever, and then you don't really have much conflict because you're just kind of doing you, and they're doing them. But many times people postpone the legal divorce because of financial reasons, right? Or for kids. And probably some of you have experienced this with your parents, that you could tell your parents wanted to separate, but they simply didn't because there was a kid still in the house. So that's emotional divorce. Then there's the actual legal divorce, right? And there's 3 parts. There's, in the traditional sense, husband, wife, and state, but now you should probably think of it as person state, right? It could be husband and husband, it can be wife and wife, right? Person, and the state. But it can be super expensive, right? Many of you probably, again, already know this. If your family has experienced divorce, you probably know that it's super expensive. Sometimes it's needed, but expensive nevertheless. So that's the actual legal divorce. Station number 3 is this kind of economic divorce, right? So, maybe the legality has happened, right? Maybe the emotional has happened, but the economic is separating your financial situation from the other person. Because if you're living together, then you clearly have financial means wrapped up in each other. Let's say one person buys a new place and you separate bank accounts and you get the other person off of your, life insurance. Right? There are economic factors, financial decisions that you need to do or make when you split up from somebody, right? But this usually comes after the legal issues, right? If you legally say, okay, I'm divorcing this person, then because it's in stone, yes, you are legally separated from this person, then you take care of the economic stuff. But that can last for years. Again, if you have a house and it's in both your names, right, and you struggle to sell the house, you're not quite economically separated from the person. Station number 4, there's co-parental divorce. Right? So, if we think about kids being in the situation, again, we can go back to this emotional divorce, right? That you emotionally separate, but you stay together for the kids. Well, this is, you are separating, and there are kids involved. Right, so you got to make decisions about what's going to happen with the kids, right? Who are they going to stay with? Who has custody? Who gets who what weekend? And this can often result in many different fights. There is the community divorce. Now, if this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, I want you to think of it as a breakup you've gone through. And if you haven't gone through a breakup, bless you. But nevertheless, think of it as if you've gone through a breakup, right? You and your boo were super close for 2 years, right? You were dating for 2 years, and you became friends with their friends. But you now split up. Well, what do? Do you stay friends with their friends? I mean, they were their friends first, right? You kind of only became friends with them because you started dating this person, but you really like them, but you split up with this person. So what do? Do you stay friends? Do you not stay friends? Do you stay friends with those friends, but now it's awkward because now you hang out with them, and every once in a while your ex shows up, like, oh god, that's awkward. Like, what do you do, right? That's what I want you to think about in regards to community divorce. right? You are not only separating yourself from that person, but that person is associated with other people and places and activities and clubs and this, that, and the other thing. And when you separate from that person, you're not just separating from that person's personality, but the entirety of that person. Or at least that's what you have to address, is all of the social and community aspects that person brought along. And then there's psychic divorce, right? And this sounds kind of weird because of the word psychic, but nevertheless, this is completely mentally separating yourself from this person, right? So again, think about it from a breakup perspective, right? When you first split up, you're still thinking about your ex, right? That happens. But then over time, over the next couple weeks and months and hopefully years, right, you stop thinking about this person, right? They don't live rent-free in your head anymore, right? You stop spending mental energy on thinking about them, and you gain this independence mentally, right? You gain this independence because you're just not thinking about them anymore. You've moved on. You've gotten with somebody new, right? That kind of stuff. However, it's entirely possible that a person never goes through this, right? Because if, say, for example, you were married to somebody for 20 years, you had 5 kids together, and you split up, well, then every time your 5 kids mentions mom or dad, you got to think about the person you split up from, right? And that may bring back some good memories, some bad memories, all sorts of stuff. So it's possible that you may never actually go through this. But nevertheless, those are 6 stations, right? 6 aspects of divorce that people often have to go through. So when divorce happens, when separation happens, right, what actually happens to the adults, right? Developmentally, what happens to adults as they go through divorce, and after the divorce occurs, what kind of happens to them? Well, we usually think about it in 3 main categories. Economical, right? So the financial side of things, the mental and emotional, and physical, right? So financially, right, standard of living, oftentimes for women, it declines. Again, if women are historically and traditionally and socially expected to not work and live off of their partner's income, and then they get divorced, then they all of a sudden have to go out and work, and that job might not pay as well, right? That standard of living declines. But for men, right, they get divorced and they still have their job, right? Because socially they're expected to have a job. Well, now they don't have all those extra bills to pay. They don't have to take care of this other person. Well, cool. So there's usually less decline or a potential increase because they don't have these bills to pay, right? They now have all this money and they don't have to, feed this extra person or pay for this home, right? They're just, paying for themselves, right? So that's that difference. In regards to, mental and emotional health, oftentimes both men and women suffer from a lot of depression and anxiety. That should make total sense. You just went through a divorce. You just went through a breakup, whatever it is. That sucks, right? And many folks can develop depression and anxiety because of that. Again, that's social isolation, right? If you kind of integrated yourself into their lives and into their community, and then you split up, and now all of a sudden you kind of lost your friends because your friends were their friends, that can potentially leave you isolated. And then if you need a greater example for losing those friendships, I want you to watch that clip. Physically, because of the stress that divorce often brings, that stress can often take a physical toll on you. And you may develop more health problems. And because of that stress, you may die sooner. Right? People forget how real stress is. Stress isn't just a thing that's in your head that you're making up. When you're stressed out, it has real physical consequences. And if you're stressed out because of a divorce or a breakup or whatever it is, right? And you're, say, an adult, and a divorce process goes on for years, and it stresses you out, then that may lead to you dying sooner. Believe it or not. And then, of course, if you're stressed out and you got health problems and you're just saying, screw it, I'm sick and tired of this stuff, you may engage in some risky behaviors because of all of that stuff piling up, and you're just ready to throw your hands up in the air and just say, screw it all, right? I'm going to go have a midlife crisis and buy a Ferrari, right? Whatever it is. Now, what about the children? Right? So, if you get a divorce, oftentimes there are kids involved, right? Maybe you don't have kids, right? Maybe it's just a clean split. Oftentimes, when we think about divorce, we got to think about kids. Over half of divorces involve children. Right? And children, there are usually 5 kind of distinct factors that influence children, there are 5 factors when people get divorced that are affecting children. Right? So children undergo, obviously, personal adjustment. Right? They have to figure out how to cope and regulate the emotions that come along with, okay, mom and dad aren't together anymore, and now I have to bounce between homes and all this and that and the other thing. Right? They got to personally just adjust to it. Now they got to figure out their interpersonal relationships. Right? What am I allowed to tell mom? What am I allowed to tell dad? Do they talk to each other? What do I tell my friends? Right? How do I adjust to just my personal relationships with this divorce? Right? Or how may the divorce, the stress from that, affect their friendships? Right? If you're just stressed out from your parents getting divorced, you may lash out at your friends. Right? You may practice some antisocial behavior. Right? If you're sick and tired of arguing and bickering and you just want to be alone for a while because you're just kind of, just stressed out, or, you're just social battery is dead because you're jumping around from house to house and, you're listening to other people's problems all the time, you may not want to hang out with other people. Right? You may be a little antisocial. Your cognitive functioning may change. Again, if you are stressed out, that can have real physical effects, including how your brain works. Right? We often talk about, in regards to school, like, oh, my brain is fried. Right? Or like, I am just beat. I am tired. That's talking about your brain. Your cognitive functioning may decrease if you are stressed from going through a divorce as a kid, right? And then, of course, your self-esteem, right? Many kids blame themselves for divorces. Many kids do, right? It's not logical, but they do, right? And that is going to affect their self-esteem. So we were just talking a lot about this stuff, but nevertheless, here's a little deeper look at it all. Is there a greater effect on boys or girls in regards to personal adjustment? Relatively equal. Conflict, greater impact. Involvement of non-custodial parent, right? So we were talking about this personal adjustment of, okay, if I'm now all of a sudden living with mom, but I used to have dad around all the time, Well, how does my relationship with dad now change? Right? For interpersonal relationships, you're talking about this, right? How does a divorce affect how you engage in your own relationships? Oftentimes, many kids engage in high-risk sex, right? Risky sex, right? So that's lack of protection, lack of contraception. They date earlier, right? They choose choose high-risk partners. They may cohabitate before marriage, and they also they have a higher chance of divorce, right? That intergenerational transmission. And again, if we hearken back to this idea of stability, right? If your parents got divorced and you see unstable relationships as the normal, right? As the norm, then you are likely to engage in all of these behaviors that exhibit a lack of stability. Like we said, antisocial behavior, right? Deviant behavior, right? Less likely if two adults are present. If there's only one adult and they're working, right? You may be a little more antisocial because that lack of supervision. Cognitive functioning, talked about this. And then the self-esteem. However, there are some positive outcomes of divorce, right? It is not always negative. It has been shown that for many kids who have gone through a divorce, that they are often more mature in many different ways. Yes, all of this stuff is still very real, right? But this is not the only things that can happen to a kid that goes through divorce, right? They don't all, have lower academic achievement. They don't all become antisocial. It is entirely possible that some children become more mature, right? That they think or they realize, like, oh, shit happens, right? Like, stuff happens, right? And maybe, maybe I'm going to learn from a young age how to better address conflict. Or that the world can be a crappy place sometimes. Right? And that kind of wise perspective can lead to higher self-esteem. Right? Think about why that might be. Because if you are a child and you see your parents get divorced because they value, themselves in a way that, hey, I was not happy in that relationship and I want to be happy, right? I was not being fulfilled in that marriage and that's something that's important to me. That child may pick up on that. That, oh, my happiness, my fulfillment is so important that even if my marriage isn't cutting it, then I need to prioritize my own happiness, right, and fulfillment. That may lead to higher self-esteem, right? And that may also allow them to be better at empathizing. And hey, you know what? My parents got divorced too. I feel you, right? I've been through the ringer also. I understand what it's like, right? So that can be some positives. For adults, right? If you get divorced, you may have the chance for a better life, right? If you were in a crappy marriage that just was not cutting it, well, now you're not worried about that person anymore. You can go, you can do your own thing. You now have this increased independence. Hopefully from all that conflict, you were able to have some personal growth. You developed as a person. You became wiser and stronger for this new and better life. For women specifically, right, they can often have career opportunities. Again, if you were at home having a child, right, or taking care of kids because that's what you were expected to do, and now all of a sudden say you get divorced and you don't have to worry about those kids anymore. Hey, you can go work, right? You can go do your own career, right? Because you don't have to worry about those things anymore. And that can certainly lead to some increased self-confidence. For a lot of men, like we mentioned, they may now have more money to spend for themselves, more time, right? They may look for new partners, right? Hey, I went through this marriage thing once. I feel like I can do this again, but maybe I'm going to do it better this time, right? I got a nice job, I got a nice house, whatever. Let me try some new partners, right? Maybe my communication was terrible in my last marriage, so I'm going to really improve that this time. Alright, so that's it. So that is the meat and bones of separation and divorce. So, I'll wrap up this one just like I always do. Please email me if you have any questions, comments, concerns. Again, hopefully the audio was a lot better talking into this than my laptop. Again, I don't know why, but that's where we're at. Email me with any questions, comments, concerns about life, coronavirus, WVU, whatever it is. I'm here to help. Till next time, wash your hands. Stay safe out there. Practice your social distancing. See you next time.